They said storms on the Montana plains could tear the soul right out of a man. But that night, as the sky split open and the wind screamed like a dying coyote, Hank Lawson didn't run. He stood in it, hat low, coat flapping like a flag of defiance, fighting to keep his world from being ripped apart. The first strike of thunder shook the ground beneath his boots. The barn doors rattled. Rain came down sideways, slicing through the night like shards of glass. Out in the dark, horses neighed in terror, their hooves slamming against wood and earth. Hank shoved through the mud, his lantern barely staying lit in the howling wind. He was a man carved out of grit and dust, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, every motion deliberate. His face was lined from years of wind and worry, but his hands never shook. When he swung open the barn door, his heart dropped. His best mare, Luna, lay trembling in the straw, her side gashed open by a jagged plank torn loose from the storm. The roof sagged above her, creaking, one hard gust away from caving in. "Easy, girl," he muttered, voice low and calm, the same tone that could quiet a wild stallion. "We ain't going down tonight." He threw his shoulder under the broken beam, grunting as he lifted it high enough for Luna to stand. Every muscle burned. Every breath came with the taste of rain and blood. The mare stumbled but trusted him, leaning into his strength as he dragged her to the far stall. The roof groaned, then gave way with a thunderous crack just as he pulled her clear. For a long moment, Hank stood there, chest heaving, soaked to the bone, watching rain pour through the hole in the roof. The barn he'd built with his own hands now looked like a busted rib cage, open and broken. When the storm finally eased near dawn, the ranch looked like a battlefield. Fences lay scattered across the fields. The corral was half gone, and the pasture looked more like a swamp. Hank wiped the rain from his beard and spat in the mud. "Hell of a night," he muttered. He walked back toward the house, a lonely two-story frame of pine and stone, perched against the wide valley. The morning light crawled slow across the horizon, turning the land silver and cold. Hank poured himself a cup of bitter coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him. He hadn't had company in years, not since his father's funeral and the war that followed. Most folks in town called him the hermit rancher, said he preferred horses to people. Maybe they were right. But as he looked out the window at the wrecked barn, he knew he couldn't fix all that alone. His pride had to take a back seat to survival. By noon, he saddled his horse, Duke, and rode into Dry Creek, a dusty town where gossip spread faster than wildfire. He tied up outside the saloon, took a nail from his coat pocket, and pinned a piece of paper to the wall. Help needed on Lawson Ranch. Fair pay, no questions. He didn't linger, just mounted up and rode back home through the wind, not expecting a damn soul to answer. The town had long stopped caring about him, and he'd stopped expecting kindness. But as he rode across the wide empty fields, a strange feeling stirred deep in his chest, a whisper he hadn't felt in years. Maybe the storm hadn't just torn down his barn. Maybe it was tearing open something else, something buried, something waiting. And somewhere out there, beyond the pines and the cold, someone was already walking toward him. A woman whose arrival would change everything he thought he knew about loneliness, courage, and love. 3 mornings after the storm, the valley still smelled of wet pine and broken earth. The wind had settled, but the land wore its wounds: muddy gullies, splintered fences, and a barn that leaned like a tired soldier. Hank Lawson fixed what he could, though his body ached from days of hard labor and nights without sleep. He figured no one would come for that job posting he'd nailed outside the saloon. Folks in Dry Creek didn't mix much with him, said he was too quiet, too proud, or maybe just too haunted by ghosts no one could name. But as the morning frost melted into mist, Hank spotted movement at the far end of his fence line. A lone figure walked the dirt road, slow, steady, and straight-backed. At first he thought it was a traveler passing through, another drifter chasing scraps of work. But as she drew closer, he saw the truth. The woman wore a faded wool shawl, wrapped tight against the wind, its fringe fluttering like broken feathers. Her boots were worn thin, and her steps careful, as if every inch of ground had to be earned. When she reached the gate, she stopped. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the soft creak of the fence and the distant caw of a crow. "Morning," Hank called out, voice rough from disuse. The woman nodded once. "I came for the job." Her voice was quiet but strong, like someone who'd had to fight to be heard her whole life. Her eyes, dark and sharp, met his with a kind of calm that unsettled him. "You know how to clean a barn?" he asked. "I know work," she said simply. "Name's Nia Blackhawk." He'd heard that name once. Apache. Folks in town still whispered about the tribes that lived near the river long ago, the ones who got pushed out when the railroad came. But there was no anger in her tone, no begging in her words, just quiet certainty. Hank hesitated. Something about her presence, thin, cold, but unbroken, stirred a strange respect in him. "Barn's out back," he said finally. "Pays fair. Start today." She gave a short nod, walked past him, and set to work without another word. Hank watched from the doorway as she rolled up her sleeves and picked up a shovel. Her hands were small but strong. She moved with practiced precision, scrubbing, hauling, rinsing, her body tense with focus. When the wind blew, strands of dark hair slipped from beneath her shawl and stuck to her cheeks. Hours passed. She didn't stop to rest, didn't ask for water. When Hank offered coffee from a tin mug, she just shook her head. "I brought something," she said, pulling half a piece of bread from her cloth bundle. She ate it slowly like a ritual, saving a crumb or two in the corner of her palm. By late afternoon, the barn no longer smelled of rain and rot, but of fresh hay and sun-warmed wood. Hank had to admit, she'd done in one day what would have taken him 3. As the sun dipped low, he leaned against the stable door. "There's a cabin near the paddock," he said. "You can stay there tonight if you want. It's warmer than the road." Nia tightened her shawl around her shoulders and looked out toward the fading horizon. "No," she replied softly. "I'll leave when the light does." Hank frowned. "You walking back to town?" Her lips twitched, half a smile, half a secret. "Not town," she said. "Home." And that was all. She washed her hands in the trough, dried them on her skirt, and started down the dirt path, her shadow stretching long in the evening light. Hank watched her go until she disappeared beyond the line of pines. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. He went back inside, sat by the fire, and poured himself another cup of coffee, but it tasted flat, empty. His mind kept wandering back to that quiet woman with the eyes of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. He didn't know what it was, pity, curiosity, or something older, but it gnawed at him. The way she'd refused comfort, the way she'd walked away alone into the coming night. That night, as the coyotes howled across the ridge and the embers burned low, Hank found himself standing by the window, staring out at the road she'd taken. He didn't realize it yet, but that single walk down his fence line had set something in motion, something that would change both their lives forever. For the next few days, life on Lawson Ranch fell into a strange rhythm. Every morning before dawn, Hank would find Nia already walking up the dirt road, her shawl drawn tight, her steps steady and sure. She worked hard, harder than any ranch hand he'd ever hired. And when the sun began to fall behind the ridge, she packed her tools and vanished down the same winding path without a word. She didn't linger for talk, didn't smile, didn't ask for anything. But her silence said plenty. Hank had seen women like her before, farm wives who buried their hearts under duty and drought. But Nia's quiet ran deeper, like it came from somewhere far beyond the valley. Each day he told himself not to pry. Yet by the 4th morning, curiosity had rooted itself in him like a stubborn weed. He noticed small things, how her hands trembled when the wind turned cold, how she saved half her lunch every day, wrapping the crumbs in a square of cloth, how her eyes would sometimes drift toward the forest beyond the far pasture, soft, longing, cautious. That night, Hank sat by the dying fire, turning those details over in his mind. The storm had passed, but something else was brewing inside him, a pull he couldn't name. By dusk the next day, he'd made up his mind. When Nia left, heading toward the pine woods, he saddled up his bay gelding and followed at a distance. He told himself it was simple concern, just making sure she got home safe. But deep down, he knew better. The trail wound through tall pines, their trunks dark and whispering in the evening wind. The smell of sap and smoke filled the air. The deeper Hank rode, the more the world shrank to the rhythm of hooves and the steady drumming of his own heartbeat. At last he saw it, a small clearing half hidden by brush, where the faint glow of fire flickered through the trees. He dismounted quietly, moving closer until he could see through the cracks in the worn cabin wall. Inside, Nia knelt by the hearth, her hair loose and wild in the firelight. Around her sat 4 children, thin, barefoot, but bright-eyed. One girl, maybe 10, stirred a pot that barely had enough stew to feed them all. A younger boy carved a stick with a dull knife, pretending it was a horse. 2 smaller ones giggled beside the flames, chasing each other in circles. And Nia, she laughed. Just once. A low, soft laugh that filled the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Hank froze. It hit him all at once. The reason for her silence, her pride, her refusal of charity. Every scrap she saved, every step she took, it was all for them. He'd spent half his life building fences to keep people out, and now here was a woman who'd built her own walls just to keep her children safe inside. For a long time he just stood there, the cold biting through his coat, the smell of pine heavy in the air. He didn't dare step closer, didn't want to break the fragile peace that lived inside that little shack. But something in him shifted. He'd thought he understood hardship, losing his father, losing land to the bank, losing friends to whiskey and time. But this was different. This was survival, stripped bare and unashamed. As he turned to leave, the faint sound of a lullaby drifted through the crackling wind. Nia's voice was low and tender, carrying words in a language he didn't understand. Yet somehow, he understood everything. He rode back to the ranch under a blanket of stars, his chest tight with something that wasn't quite sorrow, wasn't quite hope. By the time he reached the porch, the first frost had begun to settle across the fields. He tied up his horse and stood staring out at the dark line of the forest, his breath ghosting in the cold air. He told himself he'd leave it be, that her life wasn't his concern, that she had her pride and he had his boundaries. But as the wind sighed through the pines, carrying that distant melody across the valley, Hank Lawson knew one thing for certain. He couldn't unsee what he'd seen. And from that night on, every time the dawn light touched the ridge, he found himself watching the road. Not just for a worker, but for the quiet Apache woman who carried the weight of 4 lives and still found the strength to smile in the firelight. The next morning broke cold and clear, the kind of chill that bit through denim and bone alike. Frost clung to the corral fence, glittering pale under the first cut of sunrise. Hank Lawson stood there with a burlap sack in his hands, flour, beans, smoked bacon, and a bar of soap wrapped in cloth. He wasn't one for charity, never had been. But after what he'd seen last night, the dim firelight flickering over 4 hungry children and their mother's tired hands, he couldn't sit at his warm kitchen table pretending it wasn't his business. He left the sack hanging from a nail by the shed where Nia kept her cleaning rags. No note, no words, just quiet help. When Nia came that morning, she looked the same as ever, shawl drawn tight, expression calm, eyes unreadable. She worked hard, same as before, scrubbing the troughs and brushing the horses until their coats gleamed like polished chestnut. But when she reached the shed around midday, she stopped short, her gaze fixed on the burlap sack. For a moment, Hank thought she might leave it untouched. She stood there motionless, hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. Then she untied the rope, peeked inside, and drew in a sharp breath. Her shoulders trembled, though her face never changed. By evening, the sack was gone. In its place sat a small silver coin and a note written in careful block letters. Please, no more. I work to live, not to take charity. Hank read it twice, the words cutting deeper than he expected. Pride. That was the spine keeping her upright when the world tried to grind her down. The next day, he left something smaller, a pair of worn leather gloves he'd oiled himself. The day after that, a wooden comb. Nothing more. She never mentioned them, never thanked him, but he noticed the gloves fit her hands now when she worked, and the raw red marks were gone. Slowly, the air between them began to change. When Hank came to the barn in the mornings, she'd glance up and nod, a tiny gesture, but more than silence. Sometimes when he spoke, she'd answer in full sentences instead of single words. One noon, As she scrubbed a trough, he said lightly, "You got a long walk home every night." She didn't look up. "It's a good walk," she replied. "Keeps me thinking straight." "Seems to me," Hank said, leaning against the doorframe, "you think too much for someone who's always tired." Her lips twitched, and for the first time, he saw a hint of humor. Small, almost shy. "That's so, Lawson." "Reckon it is." The brief moment of warmth passed as quick as a desert breeze, but it lingered in him, quiet and stubborn. That evening, as she packed her rags, he said, "You could stay in the cabin tonight. Roof don't leak much, and there's a stove." Nia shook her head. "We're fine where we are." "We?" The word slipped out before he could stop it. She froze, then turned away, her voice firm but soft. "It's better you don't ask." And just like that, the wall between them rose again. After she left, Hank sat on the porch steps, chewing on the silence. He looked toward the dark line of the forest where she'd disappeared and thought about the life she was protecting. By now he knew she wouldn't accept pity, but maybe kindness didn't always have to be seen. The following morning, he found a small basket waiting on the porch. Inside were 6 warm eggs, feathers still clinging to the shells. No note. He smiled despite himself. Later that day, when the barn was quiet, he left a note of his own. "Thank you. Not every gift needs to be repaid." He doubted she'd ever mention it, but something told him she'd understand. In the days that followed, the ranch began to feel different. The silence wasn't so sharp anymore. It carried something gentler, like the hush before sunrise. Hank found himself repairing things he'd long ignored. The broken latch on the barn door, the cracked window pane, the crooked post by the gate. He told himself it was just good upkeep, but deep down, he knew he was making the place right for someone else. Someone who made even the loneliest corners of his land feel alive again. By week's end, he caught himself doing something he hadn't done in years. Waiting by the fence at dawn, coffee steaming in his hand, just to see a familiar figure walking up the road, her shawl fluttering in the morning wind. He didn't call out, didn't speak, just watched. And somewhere inside, Hank Lawson, once a man who'd given up on the world, felt something small but steady begin to grow again. Something like hope. By late October, the Montana sky had turned a hard, wintry gray. The wind carried the scent of snow and something else. Something heavy, like a warning. Hank Lawson felt it in his bones. Storms in these parts didn't just roll in. They came down from the mountains like judgment. That afternoon, clouds piled high over the ridge, dark as smoke. The pines swayed restlessly, whispering to each other in the rising wind. Nia was still at the ranch, mending a broken halter near the corral. Her shawl whipped around her shoulders as she worked, eyes down, steady hands refusing to tremble even when the first cold gust cut across the valley. "You best head home early," Hank said, leaning on the gate. "Sky's looking meaner than a bull with a burr under its tail." Nia glanced toward the mountains, then back to her task. "We've seen worse," she said quietly. Something in her tone unsettled him. He thought of that cabin hidden deep in the pines, of the 4 small faces he'd seen laughing by the firelight. A thin roof, weak walls. God help them if the storm came down full force. By sundown, the wind howled so loud the windows rattled in their frames. Hank stood at the porch, rain slicing across his face. He watched the distant line of trees where Nia's trail vanished and felt the weight of worry settle in his chest like an old wound. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his place, that she'd chosen her life and he'd already done more than most. But when lightning cracked across the horizon, lighting up the valley in a flash of silver and ash, his decision was made before he even knew it. Within minutes, he'd saddled Duke, pulled on his slicker, and rode into the storm. The rain hit hard, sheets of cold water stinging his face. The ground had turned to mud, thick as tar. Branches snapped in the wind like gunfire. He rode faster, the horse snorting and straining against the gale. The trail to Nia's cabin was nearly gone, swallowed by mud and fallen limbs. When he reached the clearing, his heart sank. The cabin leaned sideways, one corner of the roof already torn away. Through the cracks, a weak light flickered, a single flame fighting for its life. Hank leapt from the saddle, shouting over the roar of the storm. "Nia!" The door, just a blanket tacked across the frame, flew open. Nia stood there soaked, her hair plastered to her cheeks. "Lawson?" she gasped. "What are you—" "Get the kids," he barked. "This place ain't gonna last an hour." Inside, the children huddled in the corner, eyes wide and fearful. The eldest girl clutched a smaller one tight, whispering in Apache to keep her calm. The boys were pale, their little hands gripping each other. Nia's voice cracked. "I can't leave everything." A beam split with a deafening crack, crashing down inches from the hearth. Sparks scattered across the floor. Hank grabbed her arm. "Now!" There was no time to argue. Together, they wrapped the children in blankets and ran into the raging dark. Hank lifted the youngest, a girl no bigger than a sack of feed, into his arms while the others clung to Nia's skirt. The wind was a living thing, clawing and screaming as they stumbled through the woods. Rain soaked them through, mud dragging at their boots. Twice Hank nearly lost his footing, but Nia's voice cut through the storm, firm, steady, guiding him forward. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw the faint outline of the ranch house, Hank nearly laughed from relief. The lantern he'd left on the porch glowed like a beacon in the blackness. He ushered them inside, slamming the door against the howling wind. The fire was still burning in the hearth, warm and golden. The children crowded close, steam rising from their wet clothes. Nia knelt, rubbing their hands and whispering soft words in her language. Hank poured milk into tin mugs and passed them around. "Drink slow," he said. "You're safe now." When the last clap of thunder rolled off into the hills, the house fell into a hush. Only the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the children filled the space. Nia turned to Hank, eyes shimmering in the firelight. "You didn't have to come," she said, voice trembling. "Yeah," he murmured, resting a hand on the mantel. "But I did." For a long moment they just stood there, two souls who'd fought too many storms alone. The glow of the fire painted their faces gold, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile as glass but real as the wind outside. When dawn finally broke, the storm was gone. The sky stretched wide and clean, and for the first time in a long while, Hank Lawson's house didn't feel empty. It felt alive. The storm had passed, but its echoes still lingered. The ranch smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. The fields glistened under the pale morning sun, every puddle a mirror for the wide Montana sky. Inside Lawson Ranch, the fire still burned low, wrapping the room in warmth. The children slept on quilts near the hearth, their small bodies curled together like puppies. Nia sat close by, her dark hair loose, eyes heavy but watchful. Hank Lawson leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, studying the scene with quiet awe. He'd forgotten what a house full of life felt like. The laughter, the breathing, the mess. He almost didn't want the moment to end. But peace out here never stayed long. By the third day, the sun returned full and strong, drying the land but stirring old dust best left buried. Hank was out fixing the south fence when he saw three riders coming fast from the direction of Dry Creek, kicking up a trail of brown behind them. Something in his gut tightened. The lead rider was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black hat tipped low. Even from a distance, his posture was pure arrogance. When Hank reached the porch, Nia was already there, standing stiff as stone, the color drained from her face. "Who is it?" Hank asked, though he already knew. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Raymond." The name hit like a thunderclap. Raymond Blackhawk, her husband by law, though not by love. The man who had left her with nothing but 4 hungry mouths and a trail of bruises that time hadn't yet erased. The horses slowed as they reached the yard. Raymond dismounted with a smirk carved deep into his face. 2 rough-looking men behind him, one with a scar across his cheek, the other chewing tobacco like it was his last meal. Well, well," Raymond drawled, adjusting his hat. "Didn't expect to find you living high in a rancher's house, Nia. Didn't take long to trade the wild for silk sheets, huh?" Nia's jaw tightened. "You left us to starve." "I left you to think," he sneered. "Didn't figure you'd sell my kids for a roof." At that, Hank stepped forward. "You best mind your tongue, mister." Raymond gave him a lazy once-over. "And you must be the hero. Big house, big heart. Thinking you can buy yourself a ready-made family?" He spat in the dirt. "Those kids are mine by law, and I'm taking them back." "You're not taking a damn thing," Hank said, voice low and calm, the kind of calm that meant danger. The other two men shifted, hands brushing their belts. Nia moved closer to the doorway, shielding the children behind her. Raymond pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. Got it right here. Proof from the county clerk. Their names under mine. You want to argue it? Take it to the judge. But I'm walking out of here with what's mine, or with $100 for each of them. Hank's eyes went cold. You think children are cattle you can sell off? You take one more step, and I'll show you how fast this rancher can draw. For a tense moment, no one breathed. The only sound was the soft whinny of a horse and the ticking of Hank's pocket watch, faint and steady. Then Raymond lunged. Hank met him halfway. The two men crashed into the porch railing, fists flying, wood splintered. One of Raymond's men jumped in, striking Hank across the jaw. Blood spattered the floorboards. Nia screamed, "Stop it!" But her words vanished in the chaos. Raymond grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she gasped in pain. You want to see him live? Hand me the kids! The sound of a shotgun shattered the air. That's far enough. Jed Wallace, Hank's neighbor, stood at the edge of the yard, shotgun leveled steady. His wife, Marta, was beside him, her hands trembling around an old revolver. You got 3 seconds to get off this property, Jed barked, before I make you part of the scenery. Raymond froze, eyes darting between the shotgun and Hank, who was already pushing himself up. Blood on his lip, but fire in his eyes. This ain't over, Raymond hissed. He snatched his hat from the ground, spit, and mounted his horse. You can hide behind your fences and your fancy friends, but the law's on my side. I'll be back, with papers and a badge. The three riders thundered off, leaving a trail of dust and fury behind them. Silence hung heavy after they were gone. Nia knelt beside Hank, pressing a cloth to his bleeding lip. You didn't have to fight for us, she said, voice breaking. He looked at her, steady, bruised, unflinching. Then tell me, Nia, if I didn't fight for you, who would? Outside, the wind picked up again, sweeping through the valley. It sounded like the whisper of something old and inevitable, like the past refusing to die. And as the sun bled over the horizon, Hank Lawson knew this fight was far from finished. Tomorrow the law would come calling, and he'd be damned if he let it take what had already become his family. The next morning, the air over the valley was cold and brittle as glass. The fight on the porch still echoed in Hank Lawson's bones, his knuckles swollen, his jaw tender. But what hurt most wasn't the bruises. It was the look in Nia's eyes when Raymond had ridden away. Fear wrapped in pride, the kind that never truly fades. Jed Wallace showed up at first light, coat buttoned tight and his shotgun slung across his back. You ready? He asked. Hank nodded. We ride to Helena. The judge will hear this before Raymond twists it into something it ain't. Nia stood by the wagon, her shawl pulled tight, the children bundled beneath blankets. She said little, just climbed aboard and stared out at the frozen fields. The road stretched long and lonely beneath a winter sky. No one spoke for miles. The only sounds were the creak of wheels, the clop of hooves, and the whisper of wind through dry sage. Helena's courthouse sat high above the main street, a gray stone building that seemed to swallow the light. When they entered, the place smelled of ink, dust, and judgment. Raymond was already there. He'd cleaned up, hair slicked back, coat brushed, boots polished. He leaned against a table like a man who'd already won. His lawyer, a thin fellow with a voice like sandpaper, nodded smugly as they took their seats. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, an older man with silver hair and the kind of face carved from patience, adjusted his spectacles and began. Mrs. Nia Blackhawk, he said, his tone polite but cool. You have no legal adoption papers, no record of residence, and no claim under state law. The documents provided name Mr. Raymond Blackhawk as the father of these children. Raymond smirked, folding his arms. Nia's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. He left us, she said quietly. No food, no home. We would have died if not for the mercy of strangers. Raymond's lawyer jumped up. Objection. My client never abandoned anyone. He merely sold everything he owned to buy whiskey, Hank muttered under his breath. The lawyer froze, glaring, but the judge lifted a hand for silence. Mr. Lawson, the judge said evenly, You are not here as counsel." "No, sir," Hank said, meeting his gaze. "But I'm here as witness. I saw the man raise a hand to her. I saw the fear in those kids' eyes when they heard his name. That ought to count for something." Raymond turned, eyes cold as a snake's. "You think you're their savior, rancher? You don't know a damn thing about family." Hank took a step forward, voice like gravel. "I know family ain't something you buy, and sure as hell ain't something you sell." The courtroom went still. Then from the back, the sound of a cane tapping on wood broke the silence. "Your Honor," came a thin but steady voice. "If I may speak." All heads turned. An elderly woman shuffled forward. Esther Harlan, the widow who lived near the river bend. Her frame was small, but her eyes burned sharp as ever. "I saw that man," she said, pointing a gnarled finger at Raymond. "He came to Lawson Ranch, boasting about how he'd sell those children for $100 apiece. I heard him with my own ears." A murmur swept through the crowd. The judge leaned forward. "You are willing to swear this testimony under oath, Mrs. Harlan?" "I swore before God the day my husband died I'd never lie again," Esther said. "That man's no father. He's a traitor of souls." Raymond's face twisted, the smugness gone. "She's half blind. Old woman don't know what she heard." "Mind your tongue, Mr. Blackhawk," the judge warned, his gavel striking once. He shuffled through the papers before him, then closed the folder with finality. "I've seen enough." His eyes settled on Nia. "Mrs. Blackhawk, this court recognizes you as the sole guardian of your children. Full and irrevocable custody is hereby granted." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Nia's breath hitched, her eyes shining with tears she'd been holding back for years. Hank reached for her hand under the table, calloused, trembling, but warm. Raymond slammed his fist against the desk. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You and your damned white knight." The bailiff stepped forward, hand on his holster. "That's enough." Raymond's voice echoed down the hall as he was dragged out, his threats fading into nothing but dust and footsteps. When it was over, the winter sun hung low above Helena's rooftops. Hank hitched the horses and helped Nia into the wagon. She didn't speak for a long while. The children were back at Jed's, safe. Finally, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't think the law would ever stand for me." Hank looked out toward the open road, the horizon stretching wide and endless. Sometimes the law needs reminding what's right. The wagon creaked forward, heading home. Snow began to fall in lazy flakes, soft as forgiveness. For the first time in a long time, Nia smiled. Not the cautious smile of survival, but the quiet one of a woman who'd finally won her freedom. The ride back from Helena was long, the kind of silence that settles when a storm has passed, but the ground hasn't forgotten. The horses moved steady beneath a gray sky, their hooves crunching over frozen dirt. Hank held the reins loosely, his eyes on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting toward the woman sitting beside him. Nia Blackhawk looked different now, not just tired, but lighter somehow. The weight that had lived on her shoulders seemed to have loosened its grip. For the first time, she wasn't running. The law had given her back her name, her children, her dignity. Still, Hank knew better than to trust the peace that comes too easy. In the West, quiet days often hid the sharpest turns. By the time they reached Lawson Ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the land in gold and blood-red light. The kids came running from the barnyard, Nala leading the charge, the boys close behind, little Ruth laughing as she stumbled across the yard. "Mama!" she cried, throwing herself into Nia's arms. Nia caught her up, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered soft words in Apache. Hank stood nearby, watching the reunion, something warm spreading through his chest. For a brief moment, everything felt right. That night after supper, they sat around the fire. The children were drowsy from full bellies and the comfort of safety. Hank carved quietly at a block of wood while Nia mended a shirt by lantern light. Every so often their eyes met, and in those small, quiet looks lived something neither dared to name. But peace, Hank knew, never lasted long out here. It was near dawn when he found it. The wind had picked up overnight, whistling through the eaves. Hank stepped outside to check the barn and froze. The chicken coop had been torn apart, boards splintered, feathers scattered across the ground like snow. And there, scrawled in rough red charcoal on the barn door, were 2 words: "You lose." Hank's jaw tightened. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line. But the world was still and empty. Whoever had come, if it was Raymond or one of his men, was long gone. When Nia came out, still wrapped in her shawl, her face went pale at the sight. "He's been here," she whispered. "He'll never stop." Hank placed a hand on her shoulder. "He will," he said quietly, "because I'll make damn sure of it." He saddled his horse without another word and rode into town through the cold morning fog. By nightfall, he was back, mud on his boots and a telegram folded tight in his fist. The firelight flickered against his face as he stepped inside. Nia looked up from the hearth, the question already in her eyes. "It's done," Hank said. He laid the telegram on the table. "Sheriff caught him north of Helena. He was trying to cross into Dakota territory, confessed to the threats and vandalism. He's in custody now." Nia stared at the paper like she didn't believe it. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched it. "He's gone?" she asked. "For good," Hank said. "You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then slowly, her breath hitched. It wasn't a sob, more like the sound of someone remembering how to breathe again. The children, drawn by the tone in their mother's voice, came padding in from the next room. Nia gathered them close, holding each of them as if they might disappear if she let go. Hank turned away, giving her the moment. He stood by the window, staring out across the snow-dusted fields. The stars hung low and cold above the valley, and for the first time in years, the air felt clean. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You're safe here, Nia. You and the kids. I reckon this place could use a little more life in it." She looked up from where she sat on the rug, Ruth asleep against her shoulder. The firelight danced across her face, softening the lines that hardship had carved there. "You've done more for us than anyone ever has," she said. "I don't know how to thank you." Hank smiled faintly. "Don't need thanks, just glad you're here." Outside, the wind had died, and the world was still again. For the first time in a long while, Lawson Ranch wasn't a house of silence and ghosts. It was a home, alive with laughter and warmth. Nia leaned her head back, her eyes closing as the fire crackled low. Hank watched her for a moment, then turned his gaze to the stars beyond the window. The past had finally stopped chasing her. But as the snow began to fall again, Hank realized something else. He wasn't just her savior. Somewhere between the storms and the fights, he'd become part of that family too. Winter melted slow that year. The snow pulled back from the hills, leaving the fields slick with mud and promise. The river broke its ice and began to sing again, a low, steady hum that carried across the valley like the sound of something being reborn. Life on Lawson Ranch found its rhythm. The barns stood straight again, the fences mended, and laughter had started to drift through the house where silence used to live. The children had found their footing. Nala helped Hank with the horses, Leo and Tom raced each other down the fence line, and little Ruth followed wherever her boots could carry her, her giggles echoing through the open fields. Sometimes Hank caught himself stopping in the middle of chores just to listen. The sound of small voices, the clatter of hooves, the rustle of Nia's skirts as she moved through the yard. It all reminded him what it meant to belong to something again. One golden evening, as the sun stretched long shadows across the pasture, Hank and Nia worked side by side, rebuilding the chicken coop that Raymond had destroyed. The air smelled of sawdust and warm earth. Nala handed Hank nails while Leo fetched scraps of wood from the pile. Tom stood proudly beside him, pretending to hammer, every swing of his tiny arm full of purpose. Nia watched them, her smile soft, eyes glinting with both pride and disbelief, like she still couldn't quite believe peace had found her after so many years of running. "You've got good helpers," Hank said, driving a nail home with one solid strike. Nia brushed a strand of hair from her face. "They're all I've got," she said, "and I'd do anything to keep them safe." Hank paused, setting the hammer down. "You already have, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." For a moment, she didn't answer. The late light caught her face, outlining her in gold. Then she looked at him, really looked, and something inside her seemed to let go. "I've learned not to expect help," she said softly. He smiled, the kind of smile that came slow, like sunrise over the hills. "Maybe it's time to change that." By dusk, the coop stood new and sturdy. They all sat under the wide cottonwood tree, sharing bread, cheese, and the last of the warm milk. The kids leaned against each other, eyelids drooping, their laughter giving way to yawns. Ruth climbed onto Hank's lap, pressing her small head against his chest. "Mama," she murmured sleepily, tugging at Nia's sleeve. "Can we stay here?" Nia hesitated. Her gaze met Hank's across the firelight. "That's up to Mr. Lawson," she said gently. Hank looked down at the little girl, then back at her mother. "From now on," he said quietly, "this is home, for all of you. No one needs to ask if they belong." Ruth smiled and drifted to sleep in his arms. Later that night, after the children were tucked in and the house had gone still, Nia stood by the window watching the stars scatter across the sky. Hank was at the table, whittling something small from a piece of walnut. She crossed the room and stopped beside him. "You made this?" she asked, nodding toward the little figure in his hands, a carved rooster with its wings spread wide. "Thought it might sit above the coop," he said, setting it down carefully. "New life deserves a guardian." Her fingers brushed over the carving, tracing the smooth edges. "You've given us more than a roof, Hank. You've given us something I thought we'd lost, a chance to live without fear." He looked up, his eyes steady, kind. "You don't have to fight anymore, Nia. Not here. Not with me." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the firelight flickering between them. Then Nia took a slow breath and said the words that had been sitting in her heart for weeks. "If it's not too much to ask," she whispered, "I'd like to be called Nia Lawson one day." Hank didn't speak right away. He just closed his eyes for a second, the weight of that moment sinking in deep. When he opened them again, he smiled, gentle but sure. "Then welcome home, Nia Lawson." The seasons turned, and the Lawson Ranch became more than land. It became a story told in laughter, in mended fences, in the echo of small feet running through open fields. People in Dry Creek stopped whispering about the hermit rancher who lived alone. They spoke instead of the man who took in a woman and her children and gave them a place to start again. And if you rode through the valley at sunset, you'd see them there. Hank and Nia, side by side on the porch, watching the sky burn orange over the mountains, their children playing in the tall grass. The West had a way of breaking people, but sometimes, if you were lucky, it gave you a second chance instead. Now tell me, if you were Hank Lawson, would you have risked it all for a woman like Nia? Or if you were Nia, would you have trusted a man again after the world had already taken everything from you?